Yeah, so I thought it was a powerful question for her to ask, and it's one that I myself have asked a lot over and over, and will probably keep asking as I keep writing. Questions like, who cares? What is the point? Why write? Who do I write for? And I think one of the answers to those questions is to know myself. And I I want to start by saying that this idea of knowing yourself is an old one. It actually is inscribed in stone in Egypt, in the Temple of Luxor, where the complete adage is, I wrote it down so I wouldn't mess it up. Um, Man, know thyself, and thou shalt know the gods. And the body of the temple of God is within you. So I'll say that again. Man, know thyself, and thou shalt know the gods. And the body of the temple of God is within you. So in a way, it's a roundabout way of saying that you are a God, or you have a temple within you. And the more you know yourself, the more you know this temple. So it's sort of it feels almost like a circle where you begin within yourself and then you go round and you come back to yourself. So in a way, it has been sort of the way I have approached my work. And I usually don't start with myself. I think of it as an onion, and the different layers to me. Obviously, there's my body, there's my family, and then in the African context, there's the clan. And outside of the clan, you might have the village, and then it goes bigger and bigger and bigger. So each one of these layers is a part of yourself. And for me as a writer, I sort of jumped out of the self stage and gone into more like the family and clan and village stage. There are some writers who concentrate on themselves. That's sort of like autobiographical fiction or autofiction, and they do it really, really well. For me, I feel like my life is not interesting. So writing about who my parents are, who my grandparents were, who their parents were, is my way of finding myself. So it began with finding out about someone who had been enslaved. And that's how I ended up writing the $100 Salaga. And once I did that, it actually created a whole family of characters that I could go back to over and over again. And when I met Sarah at the Pija Festival about 3 years ago now, she asked me if I'd written for young people. And because I'd already been in communion with some of these fictional and real characters in my family, I just knew right away who I'd be writing about. These twin girls who are related to in my fictional world, who are related to my great great grandmother. So I think these are good questions to start with if you want to begin to write your own story. Asking questions like, why are we here? What can we do with what can we do with being here? And some of these questions begin actually when we're young, when we're children. So I'm really, really lucky because I kept diaries, sort of like Anne Frank, and some of them have been more useful than others. Some of them painstakingly list down, what we ate for dinner, what games we played. And then others would show my state of mind, like I was actually upset today because this happened, or mommy did that to me, or my sister did that. And so I have those records that I can go to when I want to begin to construct this world of knowing myself and using that to write for young readers. And I also have another thing that makes me extra lucky because my parents were writers. So they actually sometimes would include their children in their writing. I guess it's the version of, showing your child on Instagram today. So they would write articles and then my sister and I would make appearances. So my mother in about 1991, which would make me about 7 or 8, wrote an article, and she said the 7 or 8-year-old Ayesha asked, where do Muslims go when they die? And this was an interesting question because my mother is Christian and my father is Muslim. And even at that age, I'd begun to try to make sense of my world. Here I was living in Accra, which was very Christian in Ghana, and having a Muslim father and a Christian mother. and being told at school that when we die, if you're Christian, you go to heaven. So that meant that my father's soul was condemned to hell, and I was worried. So just having that question, written down in print for me was sort of validating, because it has become one of those questions of my life. And so in almost every book, I grapple with religion. Why do we believe what we do? And if Ghana hadn't had a certain kind of history, like with Islam coming from the north and Christianity coming from the south, would my parents have that kind of religious makeup that they do? So there were all these questions that I kept asking myself, even as a child. And these questions have plagued me as I've grown up, and as I struggled as a teen who wanted to be Christian and to belong. And as I grew up into an adult who danced with agnosticism at some point, and one who has now embraced the interconnectedness of all things and beings, sort of the way that my ancestors did once upon a time. So these things I'm talking about are questions that have been in my mind for a long time. And that's why I mentioned that having the diaries, having my parents note down these things have been helpful. So I think as you write, you sort of have to go back to that time when you were a child, or even now, the things that keep you awake at night. What questions run through your mind? What do you constantly keep going back to? What are the big mysteries of your life? So these are these questions that you have to begin to take notice of and keep asking yourself. What plagues you? What have you always wanted to know? So you start with that big question that has accompanied you your whole life. It could be the most banal to the most perplexing, whatever questions there are that don't leave you, take note of them. These are important for you as a writer. These will become some of your big themes. And now you take those questions, whether it's one question or a series of questions, and the next step is to ask even more questions. So you take a piece of paper. I had one professor when I was in journalism school, and he said, his name was Stephen Isaacs. He said, for every subject that you want to find out more about, this was in a journalistic sense, but whatever the subject is, take a piece of paper and write down 100 questions about whatever it is. And it sounds very big, so I sort of pare it back to 20. Whatever I begin to write, have interest in or want to write about, I pare it down to 20 questions. And this is a strategy I've adopted in my fiction. And just go at it, 20 questions. So for the 7-year-old child that asked that question, extra questions could be, why would Muslims go somewhere else? What do Muslims do differently from the others? Who are these others? And if it's heaven that Christians say they go to, Muslims also say they have paradise. Why is there a different paradise for Muslims? Is there a different paradise for Christians? Are there different heavens? And then that big question I asked about, if Ghana had been colonized a bit differently, what would it have looked like? Would my mother be Muslim too, or would my father be Christian? What if we hadn't been colonized? So all these big questions, just set them down to paper. And all these questions must give you the drift of where I'm getting to. So you begin to see different possibilities with them. So for me, that last question, that big question of if Ghana hadn't had the kind of external contacts that it did, was a big one for me in plotting the Deep Blue Between, because I started with 2 girls who were in sort of Burkina Faso, northern part of Ghana, who sort of took different paths. So one of they definitely took different paths. One of them goes down to what would become the Gold Coast, and the other goes to Nigeria and then ends up in Bahia. So they have different influences, they meet different influences along the way. You have the one character who goes to missionary school, so she has the Christian experience. And the other character who ends up in Bahia, she gets introduced to Candomblé, which is a mixture of Catholicism and indigenous African belief. So these were questions that I started thinking about when I was a 7-year-old. And then however many years later, when I meet Sarah at the festival, these are questions that come to play and are used to explore the narrative. So yeah, you begin to ask yourself all these questions and different threads emerge. And from there, when you have your 20 questions, you go to the most compelling. And once you've settled on your most compelling questions, guess what the next step is? You're going to ask even more questions of yourself. And these are more technical questions at this point. Who can I go to answer some of these questions? Where can I get resources? Who is the best person to tell me some of these answers? So in my case, luckily I'd written the 100 Wells of Salaga before I came to the Deep Blue Between. So some of these bigger questions I had already begun to explore. So I knew I had to talk to my father, because this was a story about my paternal great-great-grandmother. So I went and I sat down with him and picked his brain on what he knew. I knew I had to go to the place that she ended up in, which was Salaga. I knew I had to read resources like missionary accounts. I needed to read traveler accounts. I needed to get access to whoever would talk to me about her. So in Salaga, what I faced over there was silence. So then the thing was, who else can I talk to? And so it was books, consult books, get oral narratives from there, get songs, praise poems. And so I had all this research I'd used already for the 100 Wells of Salaga, but then I had two new areas to explore, the Gold Coast and Bahia. Again, luckily I'd been to Bahia, and while I was there, this was maybe 3 years before I'd even thought of writing about the twins. While I was there, I encountered the Candomblé religion, and not even knowing why, I made interview requests with people who were practitioners, and some of them were scholars of the faith. And I would attend ceremonies, and I took notes. I took lots of notes, really not knowing why. So this is another thing that you learn to hone as you begin to write stories. Sometimes life just offers these things to you, like being here in the Netherlands. I'm here on a residency, but then any chance I can have to go into a museum or to talk to somebody who's studying history of here and beyond, I'm going to go for, because you just never know when the connections with your story will take place. So yeah, you begin to ask these technical questions. And then sometimes even the person to go to is Google. Google will take you down rabbit holes. Make sure that as you enter these rabbit holes, you leave a little thread you can loop yourself out with, because you get down deep, deep, deep holes. Sometimes the person that you talk to is a bit reluctant with family. Sometimes I get that. Sometimes people feel like things should be buried in the past. So pick the right moments to talk to people. Sometimes it's not even a parent. Sometimes it's someone who is just really good with stories, or who knows your family and has taken a keen interest in your family. Sometimes just sitting down with that person, you'd be surprised at how much people want to tell stories. And once you begin to do this, you become almost the griot. People come at you with things. I can't tell you the number of people who've given me things and told me stories, unsolicited. I go home and they're like, I have something for you. And it's a collection of letters or a notebook. So once you begin to do this work, I always say it's as if the universe just guides you on the way, and things come your way. So you've asked the major question, you've asked your 20 questions, you've said, who else can I talk to? Take notes, keep taking notes. Wherever you are, you have a phone or a recorder, sit down with people and take notes. And once you do this, you go back to that first question I opened up with, like, why would anyone be interested in all of this? And for me, I think it's because when you tell your story, other people find themselves. It might be one tiny problem you solve for another human being. It might be just, opening up a door for them, like, oh, this is why that is. And in writing the Deep Blue Between and the 100 Wells of Salaga, I've had so many people say, thank you for telling this story. And as I was doing it, I kept asking the Anne question, like, why would anybody be interested in this? But there's so many people who need your story. So knowing yourself, telling your story is telling a story about all of us, about humanity. And I think I'll stop here, and then Sarah, if you have more questions, we can dive back in.
Oh, thank you so much. You've I loved listening to you, and your approach to writing is absolutely fascinating. You've touched on something that I believe profoundly about literature and about people, that we do actually share humanity, and that regardless of where we're from or how we're brought, the social construct of how we're brought up and how we live, at core, people are similar all around the world. And what's different about us, our clothes, our architecture, the food we eat, the climate, the conditions in which we live, are actually the things that make us kind of fascinating too. And the lovely balance in your book and in the best books is when the reader can share the heart of the story with their heart and yet be in a different place too. It's a brilliant combination.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. A couple of things that came to mind when you were talking. The idea of questions and imagining the world. What about speculative fiction? What do you think of the idea of speculative fiction? So taking all of the research and imagining how things could, you said, what would have happened if Ghana had not experienced colonialism in a certain way? Do you think as a writer that's something that would be interesting to explore?
I definitely think so. I enjoy it terribly. And I think people who do go there have such brilliant imaginations. There's so many writers like Nnedi Okorafor and Imran Kovadi, I think I'm butchering his name, from South Africa, who just imagine these worlds. And I'm like, how do you do that? Like Nnedi has this story about a house that's that responds to the human being in it. And it's just fascinating. And I think that also helps us understand our world. And then sometimes you have books that, speculative fiction, that becomes almost predictive of our future. Like when COVID hit last year, the number of people who were trying to, put the pieces in books like 1984 and other books like that had been written was fascinating to me. I don't know if I have the skill set for that. I think I'm just, along the way, I'll just keep saying, oh, no, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't work. But who knows? I don't want to limit myself as a writer. But I think there's just so much you can do with that as well, imagining possibilities and just running away with that. And I'm just trying to think of some of the stories I've read. There's some stories from, there's a 4,000-year-old story, actually, because it's from about 2000 BCE. The Shipwrecked Sailor. It's a fascinating story, which might be speculative fiction, because there's a whale that swallows. No, there's a snake. There's a giant talking snake with gold that this traveler encounters. So it's part of the travel narrative, like Ulysses or Odysseus or any one of those travel narratives. So this man gets shipwrecked and he ends up on an island with a talking snake, and the snake gives him back all these riches. And it was fascinating. For me, that also showed the sign of the times, even though it was made up and probably not true. It still showed that in those times, there was hope. It was a very hopeful story. And then when you come into the stories that we tell in oral narratives in the Middle Ages in West Africa, the snake narrative still stays, but then it's become a different kind of story. And it's still speculative, because you have this snake who wants you to sacrifice your virgins every year. I don't think virgins were being sacrificed, but that's the story. That was what was being told. And so now it's changed. Now the snake needs to be given blood in order for the town to prosper. So that also shows what the society is like. So I think speculative fiction can do two things as well. Like it can show you what the reality is, and projects us into the future. So yeah, it's really fascinating.
I think as well that speculative fiction can offer an idea of how we can sort things out. So there's a lot of particularly young adult fiction in which there's a big social problem, ecological problem or disease, and it's about how people come together and resolve issues. And there was something that you said just now about hope. I think for me, one of the most important things about writing for young people is having hope in books. I think that young people are incredibly hopeful for the future, despite often being very worried about the situation now. Do you think fiction can help make a bridge between today's anxieties and tomorrow's hopeful, more settled, secure future?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think just even the idea of this interconnectedness that I spoke of, when you know that you're not the only one going through something, it just changes your mindset. You feel less scared, you feel more hopeful. And I think fiction has the particularly strong ability to do that. It makes bridges, it extends, hands out, like, look, this person has been through this. And I think fiction in all its forms is able to do that. Even the most dystopian or the most nihilistic, at its heart, will have something that will connect you to its protagonist or its story. And I think that's one of the strengths of fiction. So books have always been that, a record for tomorrow and hope for tomorrow as well.
And they can be a balm for the worries of today.
Yes, yes. And escapist roots as well,
Yeah. I'm interested in your process of writing. How I love the concept of the questions, asking yourself questions. How do you plot in advance? Do you write every day? What's your actual physical process? How do you physically create the book?
So I've played around with different approaches. I think my idea is to come at it very playfully as well, and not to get stale. So the first 3 books are quite heavily plotted. I would have a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, and I'd know chapter 1 has this, 2, 3, 4. And then once I had that down, once I had that roadmap, I would sort of helicopter in wherever I felt the most interest in for the day. So take in the 100 Wells of Salaga, if I felt like writing a scene where the protagonist was leaving home, that's what I would begin with. And then the next day, if I felt like writing the point where she met the woman who would enslave her, they are not connected, but that's what I felt the most compelled to work on. So that's what I would do. So it's a combination of plotting, but then allowing myself to also be inspired. And then when I wrote The Deep Blue Between, the process sort of changed. I always call it a magical one, because I just let the girls guide me. I eventually did have my spreadsheet for when it came down to editing and checking that things weren't, anachronistic or out of place. But before doing that whole plotting thing, I just let the girls guide me. So I've used that to write even my romantic novel, where I would just start writing. And that also has a different kind of power, because along the way, you meet all these surprises. And I had one professor, El Doctoro, describe it as driving in the night with just your headlights guiding you. So what you see is what you see. And then suddenly, deer appears, or suddenly you have to swerve up the road because there's a giant thing in your way. So that also has its magic and appeal. And I think each book writes itself. Each book has the way it wants to be written. So I'm learning to lean a lot into that process. Mm-hmm. When I am working on a book, I try to write every day. I try to give myself deadlines. Sometimes it's 500 words a day, depending on how much I have going on. If I'm at a residency and, that's all I'm doing, which was, I had a residency that was 9 months long, and I was child-free and 23. So I really could write every day. But now that I have a young son and I have a family and I have an ice cream business, it's really when you have time, you just sit down and try and get in 2,000 words a day. And I might write 2,000 words today and tomorrow write nothing at all. So it keeps changing. It's a very flexible process.
I've heard a lot of women say that the more they have to do in terms of looking after children and all the rest of it, actually the more they're able to write, because they know
so productive.
It's the precious time.
Yeah.
There, I'm gonna do it now.
Yeah. Like since I wrote, let's see, I wrote 3 books from 2009, 2008 to 2016. And I've written another 2.5 books in, less than half the time.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
More able to do, I think.
Yeah. You see the clock ticking and you know that in an hour, somebody's going to be awake and pulling at your hem. So
you've got to get your words down.
Literally, yeah.
And do you edit as you go along? Or do you get a first draft and then go back and edit?
I'm a first drafter. I need to just put it all down.
Yeah.
Just sort of paint the broad strokes. And then I'll come in and say, okay, this works. This doesn't. Let's check out that section. And then maybe, it looks like a face is forming here. So we can, fine tune the details here. But I definitely need to just get it all down on paper and then come back and edit. Because I feel like I get bogged down when I have to, make sure the sentences are perfect. And the way my mind works is also, it's almost like I'm seeing a scene. I can picture the scene. So I just want to capture it all down. And then I'll come back in and say, oh, okay, the sofa was angled that way. And it was, velveteen and it was this and that. But first I'm just standing outside on my camera and getting the big picture.
Fantastic. We've had some good questions from our people who are attending and listening to you. And somebody's asked, do you find yourself doing different things as a writer when writing for young adults versus writing for adults?
So I think I write. I don't censor myself. I don't say, oh, this is going to be too hard for a young reader. Mostly because I think of the kind of reader I was and how, at whatever age I began to read really closely and really well, I would take whatever and I would hide in the corner and read all sorts of things. So I think giving young people books where you go there and explain things kindly and authentically makes a difference. I was reading Toni Morrison at age 13, and some of those themes are really heavy. And it wasn't really for young readers, but I think if I had a writer who was talking about the same themes, but then explaining it a little more to me, it might have made a difference. So maybe I am, now that I think about it, maybe I am doing a slight translation as I write for young readers. I don't edit the themes, but I try to pick things apart a little bit more and say, okay, look at things this way. Because you haven't quite been introduced to all these things in the world yet, but here you go.
And presumably there's the obvious things like certain subjects that one could treat in one way in a book for adults and a book for young readers, whether young adults or teens, you would treat in a slightly different way. You wouldn't, perhaps one would avoid being explicit about it,
exactly,
up and off the page. And while you still deal with the themes of, for example, gender violence is an important thing in books for young adults, you deal with that off the page, but talk about the repercussions on the page.
Yes.
If you know what I mean.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Somebody asked, how do you deal with writer's block? Is that something that bothers you?
I used to say I don't get writer's block, but there are points when you don't feel like it. And I think I have learned to just accept it as a part of the process. And sometimes the trick for me is to still just come to the page every day. And because I'm super kind to myself with that first draft, I can write whatever. Just make sure you meet your word limits, and it could be trite, it could be whatever, but you come to the page and show up every day, and eventually the muse will meet you. Eventually you get there. So there's a certain kind of freedom that has come with that process, and which also takes away the block, because I just show up every day when I can, or when I'm writing. I just show up and I just do the 20 questions, ask yourself questions. It could be that, yeah, you just show up and you ask yourself questions, and then the next day you keep asking, and then you begin to tease stories out of those questions. So that has helped a lot.
What about notes and diaries? Something I'm always interested in is how many authors keep diaries and keep notes. Is that a kind of bridge over between those?
It could be. I think I don't want to be prescriptive at all. This is what works for me. And I always have a notebook, but I'm not a diligent note taker in that, like, I'm writing every day. It's more like, oh, when something strikes me, I just jot it down quickly, or sometimes an idea comes from there. But there's some writers who are really good diary keepers. And I've tried over the years, like I said, as I was a child, I'd have some in which it was filled with what I ate that day. And then for years, I'd go with nothing. So that is a process that hasn't quite gelled for me. But for some writers, it is the bridge that helps.
Some writers are helpful, yeah. How do you handle the doubt that is always there, whether the draft is ready to be shared or still needs to be worked on?
Oh my goodness, great question, great question. What I have done is I found a group of friends, a writer's circle, and we meet once a month, and we just share our stories with each other. So because we're writing as we share the work, everybody knows it's a draft. So there's also a kind of kindness and gentleness we approach each other's work with. And then we give each other ideas as well. So they're very helpful because they also help you think about ways in which the story can go, and you're free to take their suggestions or not. So that's helped. And then sometimes you work the same story over and over with them, and then they help you say, okay, this is good to go. And then once you do become more professional, sometimes you have agents that helped. And then working with you, Sarah, on the Deep Blue Between, that was also a nice collaborative process, because I was showing you drafts as I was going along, which sometimes is like, oh my goodness, you're almost seeing me naked. You know, this is just raw without that many changes. But I've also learned to let the ego go. You know, a lot of that is ego. It's linked to what would they think about me, and you're trying to produce the best work you can. So you set your ego aside and show it to your agent, and if she says, oh, there's work to be done, then you go back and work on it again. And I've come to embrace the process and love the process of rewriting, because that in itself comes with magic. The things you see differently, there are words, there's a word that comes and it's the best way to explain what you're trying to go for, or even a scene that just fits right in, you move things around. So I really enjoy rewriting sometimes. After you've done it for the 10th time, you're like, okay, this is enough. Somebody else take it away from me.
The process of editing is invaluable, and it does allow everybody to polish and refine their thoughts, I think.
Yeah. And
to see how they've said things, and to see if they want to say things differently. And having somebody else read your work, I mean, it's essential to get to put things through those people who are your supportive friends as well. They're not people who want to, you know, mark you D-. They want you A+.
Yeah.
They really want to work with you to make that happen.
Yeah.
Somebody's asked, what has been the one thing that has contributed the most to your growth as a writer?
Oh my goodness. That's a big one.
That's a big one.
Yeah. I think it's a series of things. It's not, I can't whittle it down to just one thing. I think having a community. So whether it's been my writer friends who read some of the first drafts, or some writer friends who have introduced me to people who've introduced me to festivals, my agents, editors like you. I do feel like I have a very supportive community, and okay, if I have to use one word, it would be that, community. And having writer friends is really important.
Somebody's asked actually about that, is how do people find writer friends? I mean, if you how do you do that? Is it local people, through people that you've met through publishing? Is it something that you can do online?
Yeah, it's a combination. Sometimes it's been at festivals. So if there's ever a literary festival near you, just go. Introduce yourself to the people who work there, introduce yourself to the writers. Some of them can be really, really warm and open. Introduce yourself to the organizers, and through that you begin to have a network, and then you just say hello, and maybe don't send them your whole manuscript the next day you met them. But just check in, say hello, support their work as well. You know, if you're doing that too, next time you come with your request, they're going to be like, okay, on Instagram, this person is so wonderful. She's always, you know, retweeting or reposting. So that's one way to do it. My agency also feels like a family. So I've been able to make writer friends that way with some of the writers that are in my agency. But if you're unagented, that might not be as easy for you. But I think going to readings and festivals, and last time I was in Accra, we had a reading. I had a reading with Nana Ofusua Ofuriatanim and Nana Dakwa Sechiama, both amazing writers. And we're talking just about this. And we had one woman in the audience say, okay, who wants to be my writer friend? And a lot of people put their hands up. So that was a beautiful way of forming a community as well. I don't know if it led to anything, but even if you have one friend come from that, it's amazing. And then I did an MFA, which also gave me another community of writers and friends to work with. I'm just trying to think of some of the unorthodox ways I've made writer friends. These are more standard. I think these days just going online, really, and sometimes just saying hello.
Yeah.
You know, I'm here in Amsterdam, and I took part in another festival that was virtual. And there's a Liberian writer who's based here, and I'm going to meet up with him because of that festival. So I think we're lucky now that we can connect with so many people online, and just sometimes dropping a note is the way to go.
Thank you so much, and I think that's it. It's actually a friendly world.
Yeah,
and it's putting yourself out there, and being open to being supported and supporting.
Yeah.
And social media, I think, is one of the most wonderful things for writers, because your writing group can literally extend around the globe.
Yeah.
And people can meet and support each other and read each other's works.
Yeah.
Thanks to that.
And don't be scared of the word no. Some people say no, not now. And you reach out to them in a few months, and the timing is right. You know, everybody has things going on in their lives. So sometimes it just doesn't work out for them, but reach out again, or say, who else can I talk to? I think that's a very good question to ask. Who do you suggest that I speak to? And that can open doors too.
And of course, there are organizations like Accord, and we're here, and we're looking to support writers and to share, like today, to share these resources, share the wisdom of people like yourself. So thank you very, very much, Ayesha. You've given us nearly an hour of your time this morning. And we're so grateful, and it's so delightful to see you again.
Thank you, Sarah.
Just over there, just over the water. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll let you go. There's so many more questions, but we'll.
And if people want to reach out on Instagram, my handle is Ayesha Attah. Sometimes I could take maybe 3-4 days to respond, but I'm happy to take 1 or 2 questions from time to time. So I'll put it in the chat window, Ayesha.
Thank you so much. And it's lovely to see you. And we're going to be moving promptly on, actually, because we've come to nearly 11 o'clock, and we are going to be talking to Sarah and Kumi, who are going to talk to us about social media. And I hope part of what we're going to have in this conversation, and I'll certainly try and make sure it's there, is this thing about writers groups online. It's really important to know that you can reach out to people and you can share your experience, and you can get a lot of support from people working through social media contacts.